I live in the Mid-South in a suburban neighborhood close to metropolitan Memphis. I went to school in Oxford, Mississippi at Ole Miss, and I married a Mississippi girl I met on campus. Life has been generous to us over the years. We are now in our 70s and we both have good health. We raised a family and all of our children have done well, and we are fortunate to have a lot of grandchildren who visit often. But there was one incident that changed our lives forever. Neither my wife nor myself have ever told this to anyone. Before I die and the story is lost forever, it needs to be told. You have a good platform for me to share it, and I hope you will do exactly that. You may use my name if you wish, but I prefer to remain in the shadows and let the story stand on its own. Every word I'm about to write is true. My wife and I graduated in the spring of 1965 and were married soon after. I landed a job back in my hometown of Memphis, and we rented a small duplex in the Berkeley area. I was making a decent living. My wife was making new friends in her new city. Things were great, and the sky was the limit as far as we could see. By 1969, we had 2 children. 2 of the most beautiful little girls God ever created. They were my life, and I spent every waking minute with them. My wife's family lived in Smithville, Mississippi, and she would travel there with the children on occasion, sometimes staying 2 weeks at a time. I was happy she was close enough to her family that she could, in just a short trip, be back in her hometown to visit and stay. It certainly helped whenever she was homesick. Her parents loved the children as much as we did. Usually, on the last weekend of her stay, I would drive down after work on Friday afternoon to spend the weekend with all of them. On Sunday afternoon, we would return home in 2 cars. I must interject that in those days, it was unusual for a young family to have 2 cars. Our family car was a gift from my father-in-law to us on our wedding day, and the car I drove was a company car my employer allowed me to use as long as I compensated them for the mileage I put on the vehicle. My company car was usually packed with items for my job, so the girls always rode home with my wife, with me right in front of them or behind them all the way home. On a spring night in 1971, we were leaving Smithville after spending the Easter weekend with my in-laws. The weather had been good all weekend, but on Sunday afternoon, one of those violent fronts began to roll through the Mid-South just as we left for home. It would be a rough drive back to Memphis on a stormy night. We pulled out of the drive around 5 p.m., not knowing the storms were so close. The first 4 or 5 miles down the gravel road were pleasant. The sun was beginning to set in the west. I could see those ominous purple storm clouds moving towards us quickly, but I didn't think too much of it. My wife is still a good driver today, and I knew my girls were in good hands. Before the rain began to fall, the wind picked up quickly. There was a steady blow with violent gusts often. It was not long before I suspected this system could produce tornadoes. My wife was a quarter-mile ahead of me, and I could not see her taillights. She was creeping along the gravel road with her vision obscured as the sheets of rain pelted the windshield. The wipers were not keeping up. She considered stopping and waiting the rain out, but making it to the main highway was her goal and would have given her a bit of confidence feeling the smooth blacktop surface under her tires. So she continued on. Darkness had fallen. Normally at this time of day, there would have been a hint of light in the western horizon, but the storm clouds in the thick forest lining the road blocked any light. My wife was struggling and certainly scared for her children. I could still not see her taillights, which in my view was a good thing. That meant she was still moving ahead. My right rear tire went flat. I had flats on this car and was quick at making a change, but of all days to have a flat, it had to happen on this night. With no rain gear, I quickly jumped back to the trunk and extracted the flashlight, the jack, and the spare and went quickly to work in the freezing rain. In another circumstance, I would have waited for the rain to ease up a bit, but I needed to catch back up with my wife, if that was even possible. I went to work raising the rear end of the car. Approximately 1 mile ahead, my wife entered the worst of the storm. To this day, we believe a small tornado touched down a short distance away from her and then moved directly over her car. But the weather service back then had no way to confirm this. In those days, a tornado was confirmed after the storm had passed and damage was assessed. There were no warnings. She was only 3 miles from the main highway when the rain stopped abruptly. Naturally, she thought she had made it through the storm, but within a few seconds her car was hammered by large hail. Within a few seconds, the front windshield was laying in her lap and all over my 3-year-old daughter, in chunks and in slivers. The wind was blowing straight into what was once a solid windshield, and then the wind picked up immediately. The trees on her left were breaking loose at the trunks and blowing across the gravel road in front of her. She mashed her brakes and was coming to a stop when a tree hit the car's left side violently, throwing the car into a deep ditch on the right side of the road. Due to the spring rains and the rain that had fallen that afternoon, the ditch was full of water. When the car finally stopped moving, my wife was on her right side against the right passenger door, crushing my 3-year-old little girl, and they were both underwater. I heard the roar of that wind ahead of me. I was tightening down the first lug and I picked up the pace even more. Finally, the tire was secure and I ran back to the driver's side door, leaving the old tire and jack laying in the middle of the road. I started the car, threw the columns shift into low gear, and quickly let off the clutch. My tires dug into the gravel and I was in motion, working my way through the gears as fast as possible, and I gained speed. I have no idea how fast I was going when I hit the first tree that had been blown across the road. My body slammed into the steering wheel as the car lurched up over a large pine tree. When I came to a stop, I could not see anything through the windshield. It was covered with pine needles and the rain fell in thick white sheets. I gathered my wits about me and threw the car in reverse to try and get off of the tree. The car would not budge. I kept on the gas, hoping my rear tires would grip something and free me from this tree, but it was no use. I got out of the car and jumped 3 feet to the ground through the mass of pine tree limbs. I backed away to look at what I had. The car was off the ground with the rear tires barely touching the gravel. I needed weight on the back of the car, but where would I get it? My mind raced and I went through everything in front of me and there was nothing I could do. I was filled with rage. My 3 girls were in trouble and I could not get to them. My wife suddenly realized what was happening. She had raised her head above the water and caught a breath of air. She was alive and her thoughts became clear and sharp. Mothers are that way when their children are in danger. There is something primal, almost animal-like, that comes over a mother of any species that causes her to become crafty and clever in the most extreme conditions in order to do anything required to keep her children safe. My wife could feel our daughter under her kicking and clawing for air. She immediately reached below her and pulled her daughter to freedom beside her. Suddenly able to take in air, our daughter began to cough and spit water she had swallowed and inhaled. It is not like the movies when a drowning person is pulled from the water and someone does chest compressions causing the victim to spit water up and then the victim smiles and all is good. No, when a human inhales water, it is very painful. Even more painful for the body to expel all the water from their lungs and throat. It takes a long time before they can fully breathe again. So our daughter suffered through the agony of expelling muddy ditch water from her lungs for days after this event. But as she coughed and vomited, my wife pushed her towards the driver's side door, which was above them now. She reached to roll the window down successfully and finally sent our daughter into the falling rain outside, where she held on to the window edge to keep from sliding off into the ditch again. But there was another child in the back seat who had been asleep. It was our 9-month-old little girl. She had been laying in a baby seat in the middle of the bench back seat. My wife looked over into the back seat and saw her feet kicking, making small splashes in the water that filled the right side of the car. Still today, my wife has nightmares of those tiny feet wiggling in the water. Back at my car, my rage heightened at my predicament. In a fit, I jumped back onto the threshold of the door and climbed over onto the hood of the car, hoping to look ahead and see my wife's car. But the rain continued to fall. I did not see any other trees ahead of me. I knew if I could just get free from this tree and get past it, I might have a chance to keep moving. But how? I began to curse and jump on the hood of the car. I was very angry to be stuck here. I noticed the front of the car began to rock forward, and I kept jumping, causing the car to tilt or seesaw back and forth. Then a loud pop, and the car settled onto the tree. A branch had broken, and the car fell some distance. I jumped back off and saw that the rear tires were now firmly on solid gravel. I started the car, and this time I put the car in forward gear and mashed the accelerator to the floor. The car lurched forward a foot or two, and then it stopped. I punched the gas again, and I was moving inch by inch. Please keep moving. Please keep moving, I whispered to myself over and over until I was free of the tree and rolling down the road again. My wife tried to crawl back into the back seat to save our baby, but she could not get over the seat. The muddy water made the vinyl seat covers slippery, and she was in a bad position to work her body over the seat. She reached and could feel our daughter's sock-covered foot, but could not pull her free because she was strapped into the baby seat, which was loosely held in place by the old seat belts of those days. She began to panic and screamed at the top of her lungs as she cried out to God to help her save her baby. Suddenly, the car moved. In her panic and agony, my wife felt the car move, then move again. She looked up at our oldest holding on to the car door and saw her looking towards the back of the car. She had stopped coughing and her eyes were wide open, almost in a trance. As my wife looked upwards through the driver's window, a large dark figure hovered above our oldest. Oh God, what now, my wife thought, and my oldest disappeared from view. Within seconds, a large hand reached into the driver's window and wrenched onto my wife's shoulder. She remembers it being very painful. She was lifted out of the car and gently set onto the muddy gravel on the road. It was a huge beast standing in front of and over the two women. Astonished at what she was looking at and at a loss for words, she remembered our youngest and screamed at the creature that there was another child in the car. The creature cocked its head like a dog does when it hears a strange sound. My wife got up and ran towards the car, pointing at the back seat window. She then ran off down into the water and began to claw at the undercarriage of the car, grabbing mufflers, exhaust pipes, anything she could reach to get up to the side of the car. She fell back into the water, came back up on her feet and tried again, but it was futile. She could not climb to gain access to her baby. I was moving at least 60 miles per hour when in my headlights I saw a car lying on its side in the ditch. I could see figures standing on the road next to the car. Oh God, let it be someone else, I whispered to myself. The rain fell straight down. The wind was gone. I punched the gas pedal, and then I saw a large figure in the distance jump onto the side of the car. The car sank deeper into the ditch from the weight of this thing. I was closer now and I could see clearly what was happening. I slowed. The dark figure lifted its leg and broke the glass of the window. It laid flat on the side of the car and was fishing with its arm for something in the back seat. I could see my oldest daughter now, and this confirmed my worst nightmare. This was my family. I came to a complete stop and jumped from the car and started running. I could see my wife now in the water clinging to the underside of the overturned car. She was crying and screaming at this thing on the car. I hit the ditch at a full run and climbed up the rear bumper, slipping and falling several times until I made it onto the side of the car. I was about to jump onto the creature that was reaching into the car when suddenly its body lifted upright in a quick motion. There was a wet yellow blanket in its huge left hand. My daughter, it had my little girl. I started to lunge and try to pull her from its hand, but the creature reached over me, clenching down on the back of my leg. It lifted me straight up, upside down, and jumped with my daughter in one hand and me in the other to the road. It gently laid me onto the gravel. It then moved to the ditch and moved my wife out onto the road beside me. If this was not strange enough, it lifted its left hand to see what it had removed from the car. My daughter's legs hung limp between the creature's fingers. There was no life there. My wife began to cry and moan and beg the creature to hand my daughter to her, but the beast just looked at the baby in its hands. It clearly knew it held a baby, and I saw a gentle posture come over its whole being. Taking a deep breath with a long exhale, the massive right hand moved over my daughter's body, and one large index finger gently pressed on my daughter's tiny chest. My wife went silent. All I can remember was silence and rain. And in the glow of those headlights, I watched a female Sasquatch gently push water from my daughter's lungs. One small amount of water spit above her little mouth, and then another, and then another, and then she coughed, and then she cried, and we all cried. And the beast looked at us and smiled in a strange way. She lowered herself onto one knee and handed our daughter to my wife. Then she stood up. She arched her back as if to say, this was a good day. She inhaled a massive amount of air and expelled it with a loud moan. It sounded like a 1,000-pound wolf. I heard others inside the trees. She stepped into the flooded ditch and came up on the other side. She looked back once, and then she was gone. Headlights from a tractor broke us from our trance. It was my father-in-law. He had no idea what was happening and had thought to patrol the road to make sure no one needed any help after that storm. He didn't know he would drive up on his own daughter's family. We had to wait in my car for an ambulance to get to us and take my girls to the hospital to be examined. It seemed like hours. On the following Wednesday, we were back in Memphis, and my girls were okay. We were a family again. It became obvious 2 years later that my youngest daughter had suffered minor brain damage from lack of oxygen on that day. There were no tests then to see what the effects had been, so we had to wait. The disability is not bad, and she is now a productive member of society. The damage was not to her learning abilities. It was only to a few motor skills and physical abilities. But she still plays softball with a group of girls she grew up with, so it has not affected her ability to enjoy her life. Nor did it affect her chances to become a veterinarian. She works for one of the largest zoos in the nation and specializes in and cares for primates. My wife and I go back to that spot in the road every Easter Sunday and leave a huge bag of goodies a short distance into the woods. We don't know who takes the bags, but the next morning they are always gone. We like to think that the Sasquatch remember us too.